The wind howled through the frozen forest, carrying the scent of something fragile, something helpless. 8 tiny puppies lay shivering in the thick snow, their golden fur barely visible beneath the icy frost. Their whimpers were swallowed by the merciless night, their breath fading into the bitter air. Then, a low growl came from the shadows. Piercing yellow eyes emerged, a pack of hungry wolves. Their massive paws crunched against the snow as they circled the trembling pups, teeth bared, breath steaming. Death was closing in. The wind howled through the frozen forest, its icy breath weaving through the towering trees like whispers of an unseen force. Snow blanketed the ground, pristine and untouched, save for the lone path Walter Briggs trudged along. The old ranger had patrolled these woods for decades, knowing every ridge, every clearing, every trail. Yet tonight, his feet led him somewhere different. His usual route lay to the west, but for reasons he could not explain, his instincts nudged him eastward, a pull, a shift, something deep inside urging him to take a detour. Though his mind resisted, he hesitated for a moment, looking at the dark expanse before him. There was nothing unusual about this part of the forest, no signs of poachers, no known trails, just the wilderness, vast and quiet. But the feeling didn't fade. If anything, it grew stronger. Go. It wasn't a voice, not exactly. It was something quieter, deeper, like a whisper carried on the wind. Walter exhaled, adjusting the rifle slung over his shoulder, and followed the invisible pull into the unknown. That was when he heard it, a faint, pitiful whimper. Then another. He stopped, his breath catching in his throat. The sound barely rose above the wailing wind, yet it sliced through him like a knife. His fingers instinctively tightened around the strap of his rifle, scanning the landscape ahead. His trained eyes picked up something small, something barely moving in the snow. Then his heart nearly stopped. 8 tiny golden retriever puppies lay scattered across the frozen ground, their frail bodies trembling violently. Their golden fur, now dusted with frost, barely stood out against the white abyss. Some whimpered, curling into themselves for warmth, while others lay completely still, their shallow breaths creating fragile wisps of vapor in the freezing air, each one a whisper away from disappearing forever. A surge of anger flared in Walter's chest. Who could have done this? But before he could move, before he could even process the horror before him, his blood ran cold. A shadow shifted in the darkness. Walter's breath hitched, his fingers instinctively reaching for his rifle. Then he saw it. A massive gray wolf stood just feet away from the helpless puppies. Its powerful body was rigid, muscles coiled beneath its thick, snow-dusted coat. Its piercing amber eyes glowed like embers in the moonlight, locked onto something unseen beyond the clearing. Then came the growl, low, deep, dangerous. The wolf's lips curled back, revealing long, glistening fangs. Its breath misted in the freezing air, its stance poised, not with the hunger of a predator, but with something else. Walter's heartbeat thundered in his chest. He had seen wolves hunt before, had studied their instincts, their tactics. A wolf would never hesitate with prey lying defenseless before it. But this one wasn't moving. It wasn't hunting. It was guarding. Walter's fingers clenched around his rifle as his mind raced. Why? Every rule of nature dictated that this should be a massacre. Yet instead of striking, the wolf stood between the pups and something else. Then the forest shifted. A rustling in the distance. Walter inhaled sharply. More eyes. More movement. And suddenly, it made sense. His pulse quickened as his mind pieced it together. This wolf wasn't protecting the puppies out of kindness. It wasn't raising them. It wasn't their mother. It simply refused to let them die. A chill that had nothing to do with the cold ran down Walter's spine. He had spent his life studying the wild, believing he understood its every rule, its every unbreakable law. But this defied everything he had ever known. Was it instinct? Or was it something more? Walter swallowed hard. For the first time in years, he felt a presence greater than himself, something unseen pressing against his chest. A nudge. A whisper. A call. You were meant to be here. The thought struck him so deeply it nearly staggered him. He wasn't a man prone to superstition. His faith had always been quiet, carried in the small moments, the sunrises over the mountains, the life he had chosen to protect. But standing here, in the heart of the frozen wilderness, staring into the unwavering amber eyes of a beast that should not have been merciful, he felt the weight of something divine. This was no accident. This was no mere chance. Something had led him here. Then the wolf moved. It lowered itself slightly, breath misting in the air, muscles rippling beneath its thick coat. And then it bared its fangs, not at the puppies, but at the darkness beyond them. Walter barely had time to react before he saw them. More wolves. They moved like phantoms, emerging from the tree line, their hungry eyes glinting under the moonlight. Walter's grip on his rifle tightened. He had been wrong. This was not a moment of hesitation. This was a war waiting to begin. And in that instant, he knew he was not here to be a witness. He was here to intervene. The air crackled with tension, the bitter wind carrying the scent of blood and fear. Walter Briggs barely had time to process what he had just witnessed, a lone wolf, not hunting, but guarding 8 fragile lives. But his moment of shock was cut short. From the shadows of the forest, more figures emerged, bigger, stronger, more ruthless. A pack of wolves, 6, maybe 7, stalked forward, their eyes glowing in the dim moonlight. They moved in perfect unison, their lean bodies slicing through the snow with practiced ease. Unlike the lone wolf that stood between them and the puppies, these were not conflicted. They were here to kill. Walter's heart pounded in his chest. He had seen enough hunts in his lifetime to know how this would play out. The pack had sensed weakness, the helpless whimpers of the puppies, the bloodied and exhausted state of the lone guardian. This wasn't just an opportunity. It was an inevitability. The guardian wolf tensed, its thick coat bristling like a storm-gathering force. Its lips curled back, exposing long, bloodied fangs, a snarl ripping from deep within its chest. The snow beneath its paws had already begun to stain crimson from earlier wounds. It was outnumbered. It was outmatched. But it would not stand down. And the pack knew it. A low, rumbling growl spread through the attacking wolves, their breath steaming in the icy air. They spread out, forming a half-circle around their lone adversary, cutting off any possible escape. Then, they attacked. The first wolf lunged forward with lightning speed, fangs snapping toward the guardian's throat. But the gray wolf struck back. The blur of fur and fury, claws raking across the attacker's side, a pained yell piercing the night. But there was no time to recover. A second wolf crashed into its side, forcing it down into the snow. Then a third, teeth clamped onto flesh. The guardian twisted violently, snapping its jaws, but the weight of its enemies was crushing. Walter felt his hands trembling. His instincts screamed at him to intervene, but his training, his years of understanding the brutal laws of nature, held him back. This is the way of the wild. Yet, as he watched, his chest tightened. The guardian wolf was losing. Its legs buckled beneath the force of the pack, blood darkened the snow around it, its snarls became hoarse, each breath labored. Yet it still fought, still resisted, even as its body wavered from exhaustion. This was not just instinct. This was defiance. Walter clenched his jaw, his grip tightening around the rifle. He couldn't just stand there. Then, the largest wolf of the pack, a hulking beast with scarred fur and dead, unfeeling eyes, moved in for the final blow. Walter moved. Boom. A gunshot exploded through the silence, shaking the trees, scattering the snow. The entire pack froze. The sound of death had arrived, but not from the guardian wolf. Walter stood tall, his rifle still aimed skyward, smoke curling from the barrel. His boots were planted firmly in the blood-stained snow, his stance a silent warning. The attacking wolves hesitated, ears flattening, their golden eyes darting between Walter and the wounded guardian. Then, one by one, they backed away. They were savage. They were ruthless. But they were not stupid. A lone guardian might have been easy prey. A guardian with a human behind it? Not worth the risk. The pack leader let out a guttural snarl, snapping at one of the younger wolves before turning back toward the woods. Then they vanished, disappearing into the night, ghosts swallowed by the storm. Silence. Walter let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The air was thick with tension, his pulse thundering in his ears. Slowly, cautiously, he turned his gaze back to the guardian wolf. It was still standing, barely. Its legs trembled beneath its weight, blood streaking its silver coat, its sides heaving with exhaustion. Its ears flicked toward Walter, but it did not move, did not growl. For the first time, Walter saw something in those amber eyes that he never expected. Not just wildness. Not just survival. Something deeper. Something almost human. A question. A hesitation. A moment of fragile, wavering trust. Walter, still gripping his rifle, slowly, very slowly, lowered the barrel. He did not speak. He did not step forward. He simply stood there, waiting. The wolf's muscles remained tense. It did not take its eyes off Walter for a second. It almost looked as if it were making a choice. Then, finally, it turned away. Not out of fear. Not out of submission. Because its purpose had been fulfilled. It took a slow, unsteady step into the snow. Then another. It did not look back. Walter exhaled, his breath visible in the cold night air as he watched the wolf fade into the darkness of the forest. It left behind only a trail of blood and paw prints, soon to be covered by the falling snow. It had fought. It had bled. And now, it was gone. But its battle was not in vain. Because as Walter finally turned to the 8 tiny puppies, still shivering in the snow, still alive, he felt something stir deep within him. A whisper. A calling. This was no accident. This was no mere chance. Something had led him here tonight. Something greater than himself. He knelt beside the puppies, gently gathering them into his arms, their fragile warmth pressing against his chest. Tomorrow, the world would return to its normal rules, its harsh truths. But tonight, the laws of the wild had been rewritten. And somewhere, deep within the frozen forest, a wounded guardian walked alone, carrying the weight of the night's battle. And a purpose that had changed the course of fate. The night was still, yet Walter Briggs could hear nothing but the frantic thump-thump of his own heartbeat. His breath came in short, uneven bursts as he knelt in the snow, reaching for the nearest puppy. It was so small. The tiny body trembled violently, golden fur crusted with frost, breath weak against Walter's gloved hand. Still alive, but barely. One by one, he gathered the rest, cradling their fragile forms against his chest. Their whimpers were faint, their little paws twitching as if grasping for warmth that had long abandoned them. And yet, they had survived. Not by chance. Because of the wolf. Walter swallowed hard, his throat tightening as the image of those amber eyes seared itself into his memory. In all his years, he had never seen anything like it. He had spent a lifetime understanding the laws of the wild. But tonight, they had been rewritten before his very eyes. Not everything wild was cruel. Not everything abandoned was meant to die. He shifted the puppies carefully against his coat, shielding them from the biting wind. Then, with one last glance at the blood-streaked snow, he turned toward home. A warmth in the cold. The old wooden door creaked open, releasing a flood of warmth from inside the cabin. Walter stepped in quickly, shutting out the howling wind. He wasted no time. Moving swiftly, he placed the puppies on a thick woolen blanket by the crackling fireplace. As soon as their tiny bodies touched the warmth, they stirred. One let out a weak yawn. Another barely twitched, its tiny chest rising and falling unsteadily. Walter knelt beside them, rubbing their frozen fur with a towel, trying to coax life back into them. His hands, rough and calloused from years of work, moved with surprising gentleness. "Come on, little ones," he murmured, his voice hoarse from the cold. He worked tirelessly, drying them, warming them, checking for signs of frostbite, listening for the faintest sound of breath. Minutes passed. Then an hour. One by one, the puppies stirred. One by one, they survived. Walter let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. His body sagged against the wooden floor, exhaustion finally settling in. But more than that, he felt relief. For the first time since he had found them in the snow, he allowed himself a moment of stillness. Then, closing his eyes, he whispered a prayer. "Thank you, Lord. Thank you for leading me to them in time." The wind howled against the cabin walls, but inside, life had been restored. And yet, something gnawed at him. Walter opened his eyes, staring into the flickering flames. Who had left these puppies out there? Who had abandoned them in the middle of the wilderness, knowing they would never survive? The thought wouldn't leave him. Walter had spent too many years in the wild to believe in coincidences. This wasn't just neglect. This wasn't just cruelty. Something was wrong. A trail left behind. Walter grabbed his coat and rifle once more, stepping back out into the cold. Snow had settled again, soft and untouched, but the night still carried a weight, a silent whisper of unfinished business. He retraced his steps, returning to the clearing where he had first found the puppies. The scene looked different now. The chaos of the wolf attack had left the snow-torn, disturbed, stained with blood. But as Walter scanned the ground, his sharp eyes caught something else: tracks. Not wolf tracks. Boot prints. Walter's breath hitched, his fingers instinctively flexing around the strap of his rifle. These tracks weren't old. They had been partially covered by snowfall but were still clear enough to follow. Someone had been here, and whoever they were, they hadn't wanted to be found. Adjusting his grip on his rifle, Walter set off, following the footprints deeper into the forest. The trail wound through the trees, past the frozen creek, then over a ridge that he rarely patrolled. It led to an area that had long been abandoned, or so he had thought. But as he moved closer, a faint glow flickered through the darkness. His pulse quickened. A fire. Someone was out there. Walter slowed his pace, stepping carefully behind a tree, listening. And then, voices. Low, urgent, and full of something unmistakable. Fear. A terrible truth. Did you clear everything? A man's voice. Sharp. Tense. I thought you got rid of those damn puppies. If the cops search the site, we're finished. Walter froze, breath caught in his throat. The puppies. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. They weren't just abandoned, they were left behind deliberately. Walter's jaw clenched, his mind racing. Over the past few months, he had heard whispers, rumors of an illegal operation deep in the forest. People breeding, testing, smuggling animals under the radar. The authorities had been investigating, but no arrests had been made. Had he just stumbled onto something much bigger than abandoned puppies? The air around him seemed to freeze, though it had nothing to do with the weather. His grip on the rifle tightened. This was no longer just about saving 8 helpless pups. This was something far worse. And Walter had just found the first real clue. The cold night pressed against Walter like an invisible weight, but it wasn't the winter chill that sent a shiver down his spine. It was the words he had just heard. Words that confirmed his worst fears. I thought you got rid of those damn puppies. If the cops search the site, we're finished. Walter remained motionless in the shadows, his breath slow and steady despite the pounding of his heart. His fingers tightened around his rifle. This was no accident. This was no careless act of cruelty. This was a cover-up. His mind worked quickly, piecing together the implications. A criminal operation. An illegal lab. An animal testing site hidden deep in the woods. The authorities must have been closing in, forcing these men to abandon their work and dispose of the evidence. And that evidence had been 8 helpless puppies left to die in the freezing wilderness. If it hadn't been for the wolf. If it hadn't been for that inexplicable force that had led Walter there that night. They wouldn't have survived. Walter swallowed the anger rising in his throat. He had seen plenty of cruelty in his years as a ranger. But this was evil. A prayer in the silence. Walter slowly backed away from the scene, his steps careful, his breath barely audible. He had what he needed, proof that these men were involved. But proof wasn't enough. He needed the truth. The full truth. And for that, he needed Sarah. Walter exhaled and lifted his gaze toward the night sky, the stars cold and distant, flickering above him. Lord, if these lives are meant to be saved, guide me. For a moment, only silence answered him. Then, a shift in the wind. A quiet nudge in his soul. Walter had spent too many years in the wild not to recognize the feeling. The same force that had led him off his usual path. The same unseen hand that had brought him to the clearing in time. This wasn't over. And it wasn't just his fight. He reached into his coat and pulled out his satellite phone, fingers stiff from the cold as he pressed a number he rarely called. The line rang once. Then twice. Then, "Dad?" The voice on the other end was alert, despite the late hour. Walter sighed in relief. "Sarah. I need you to come home." A journalist's instinct. Sarah Briggs had always been restless. She had spent years chasing stories across the country, exposing corruption, uncovering truths buried beneath power and greed. But she had never expected her next investigation to come from her own father. The moment she stepped into Walter's cabin, the warmth of the fire barely touched the chill she felt. 8 golden puppies lay curled together on a blanket, their tiny chests rising and falling in sleep. Their fur was still patchy with frost. But they were alive. Sarah knelt beside them, her fingers grazing their soft coats. They had been so close to death. Her father's voice pulled her back. "You should have seen it, Sarah." She looked up. Walter stood near the fire, his face more worn than she remembered. There was something in his eyes, something she hadn't seen before. Not just exhaustion. Not just anger. Something close to awe. Sarah slowly stood. "Tell me everything." The guardian wolf. Walter recounted every detail, the cold that night, the strange pull that led him off course, the puppies barely clinging to life in the snow. And the wolf. Sarah listened intently, her reporter's mind racing to put the pieces together. But when Walter described the moment the wolf stood guard, her breath caught. "It didn't try to kill them?" she asked, her voice hushed. Walter shook his head. "No. It protected them. It fought for them. And when it saw I meant no harm, it walked away." Sarah's fingers tightened around the notebook she had instinctively pulled from her bag. A lone wolf, protecting abandoned puppies. It sounded like something out of a fable. Something too strange to be real. But the evidence lay at her feet. And then, her father told her about the voices in the forest. About the men. Their words. Their panic. The pieces clicked into place. This wasn't just a case of abandonment. This was a crime. Sarah stood, her pulse quickening. "We have to find out who these men are. We have to find that lab." Walter nodded. He had known his daughter wouldn't walk away from this. She never had. And neither would he. Sarah Briggs had spent her career chasing corruption, uncovering hidden scandals, and exposing the darkest secrets buried beneath greed and power. But this story was personal. She sat at her father's old wooden table, the scent of coffee mixing with the crackling warmth of the fireplace. The golden puppies, now safe and recovering, lay curled up beside the hearth. Walter sat across from her, arms crossed, his gaze distant. Sarah had heard horrifying stories before, but none that left her this shaken. A clandestine animal testing facility. A secret operation on the verge of exposure. Desperate to erase evidence, leaving innocent lives to die in the wild, her fingers flew over her laptop keyboard, documenting everything: the illegal research labs, the rapid evacuation when law enforcement got too close, the cruel decision to discard 8 defenseless puppies like they were nothing, and the guardian wolf standing between them and certain death. The world needed to know. Walter watched as his daughter worked tirelessly, digging into corporate records, tracking down sources, and connecting dots no one else had bothered to connect. She reached out to whistleblowers, former employees, and investigative contacts. One after another, pieces of the puzzle fell into place. The company in question operated under a clean, respectable front, claiming to specialize in veterinary medicine research, but Sarah uncovered classified reports, hidden documents detailing unauthorized experiments that required canine test subjects. And when the authorities got too close, they ran and left the puppies behind to die. Sarah's stomach twisted in disgust. How many others had been disposed of before these 8? But now, this company wouldn't escape accountability. It took weeks of relentless effort, but when Sarah finally submitted her article, she knew she had something explosive. The next morning, her headline blazed across the front pages of major news outlets nationwide. Illegal animal testing operation exposed, how a lone wolf and a retired ranger led to the truth. The reaction was immediate and earth-shattering. Public outrage erupted, animal rights organizations demanded justice, and law enforcement intensified their investigation. Within days, the government launched a full-scale probe into the company. Their facilities were raided, computers seized, financial records scrutinized. One by one, the men responsible, the executives, scientists, and field operatives who had ordered and carried out these cruel acts, were placed in handcuffs. The lab was shut down permanently. The suffering that had taken place behind closed doors had been dragged into the light. As the investigation unfolded, Walter and Sarah made sure the puppies found their way home, not just any home, but the right one. Walter had spent weeks caring for them, nursing them back to health, watching as their playful spirits returned. One by one, the puppies were adopted by loving families, people who understood what they had survived, people who would ensure they never knew cruelty again. But one puppy remained, a little golden male, the smallest of the litter, the one who had shivered the hardest in Walter's arms that first night. Sarah laughed as she saw the way he followed Walter everywhere, his tiny paws padding after him like a shadow. "Looks like he's already picked his home," she said. Walter sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Guess I don't have much of a choice, do I?" Sarah smirked. "Nope." Walter knelt, scratching the pup's soft ears. "Well, kid, looks like you're staying." The little dog wagged his tail, his golden fur shining in the afternoon sun. For the first time in years, Walter felt a quiet sense of peace settle over him. The forest had led him to these lives in need of saving, and in return, they had saved something in him too. The snow had begun to fall again, blanketing the forest in a quiet stillness. The world was moving forward. Justice had been served. The puppies were safe. And life should have been returning to normal. But one question remained. Where was the wolf? Walter stood at the edge of the tree line, his eyes scanning the vast white expanse before him. He had seen the deep wounds the wolf had suffered that night. No animal could take that kind of damage and walk away unscathed. And yet, somehow, it had. It had disappeared into the night, leaving only its blood-streaked trail behind. Sarah stood beside him, her breath visible in the cold air. "Do you really think it made it out alive?" Walter didn't answer right away. He didn't need to. He felt it, the same unseen force that had led him to the puppies, the same inexplicable nudge that had told him to veer off his usual path. It wasn't just about what he believed. It was about what he knew. Determined, Walter and Sarah retraced their steps back into the forest, following the path where the final battle had unfolded. Snow had already erased much of what had happened here, the signs of struggle, the footprints of fleeing wolves, the blood that had melted into the ice. But then, Walter stopped. A single paw print. Sarah saw it too, her breath hitching. Walter crouched, brushing away the loose snow around it. It was fresh. Sarah's pulse quickened. "It's still out here." She turned to her father, expecting him to start moving again. But Walter didn't. He wasn't looking at the paw print anymore. He was looking up. Sarah followed his gaze, and her breath caught in her throat. Standing just beyond the trees, against the pale backdrop of the frozen wilderness, was the wolf. It stood at a distance, its thick coat blending into the swirling snow, its piercing amber eyes locked onto them. Sarah felt a shiver, not from fear, but from something deeper. The wolf was different now, no longer snarling, no longer on guard, no longer wounded. Walter took a slow step forward, his movements careful, measured. The wolf didn't move. It just stood there, watching. The wind shifted, carrying the silence between them. And then, in that still moment, Walter understood. The wolf wasn't just watching them. It was acknowledging them. A moment of silent trust, of understanding, of something neither of them could ever fully explain. Walter felt something stir deep in his chest, a quiet recognition, an undeniable truth. This was no ordinary wolf. And its purpose here was not by chance. Sarah swallowed hard, her voice barely above a whisper. "Dad, do you think God sent it to protect the puppies?" Walter exhaled, his gaze never leaving the wolves. Then, slowly, he smiled. "I think sometimes God sends his angels in ways we never expect." For a long moment, the three of them stood there, man, daughter, and wolf, bound together by something greater than themselves. Then, as if satisfied, the wolf turned. It stepped forward, its powerful frame moving without hesitation. It did not run, nor did it linger. It simply disappeared into the trees, its silver coat swallowed by the swirling snow. The only thing left behind were its footprints, deep, defined, etched into the fresh white powder like a signature upon the earth. A mark. A sign. A testament to what had happened here. And to those who believed in miracles. Sarah wiped at her eyes, barely realizing the tears that had formed. She let out a breathless laugh, shaking her head. "You know, if I write about this, no one's going to believe me." Walter chuckled, placing a hand on her shoulder. "That's the thing about faith, Sarah. You don't always need proof. Sometimes, you just need to see the footprints." They stood there a moment longer, watching as the snow slowly began to erase the wolf's final trail. But even as the prints faded, they remained, not on the ground, but in their hearts. Because miracles were not always loud. Sometimes, they came in whispers. And sometimes, they came with amber eyes, hidden in the snow. As the snow continued to fall, erasing the last traces of footprints from the earth, one truth remained. Not everything abandoned is lost. The puppies were meant to perish, yet they were saved. The wolf was meant to hunt, yet it protected. Walter was meant to follow his usual path, yet he was led to where he was needed most. Some would call it luck. Some would call it coincidence. But those who have felt the quiet nudge of something greater, those who have seen light in the darkest of nights, those who have witnessed the impossible become reality, they know. This was no accident. It was grace. A reminder that God's miracles don't always come as fire from the sky or voices from the heavens. Sometimes, they come in the form of an old ranger with a good heart. Sometimes, they come in the form of a journalist seeking justice. And sometimes, they come as a lone wolf standing guard over the helpless. God moves in ways we do not always understand. But His presence is there, in the small moments, in the unseen hands that guide us, in the second chances we never expect. And tonight, He left His footprints in the snow. Step forward, His movements careful, measured. The wolf didn't move, it just stood there, watching. The wind shifted, carrying the silence between them. And then, in that still moment, Walter understood. The wolf wasn't just watching them, it was acknowledging them. A moment of silent trust, of understanding, of something neither of them could ever fully explain. Walter felt something stir deep in his chest, a quiet recognition, an undeniable truth. This was no ordinary wolf, and its purpose here was not by chance. Sarah swallowed hard, her voice barely above a whisper. Dad, do you think God sent it to protect the puppies? Walter exhaled, his gaze never leaving the wolves. Then, slowly, he smiled. I think sometimes God sends his angels in ways we never expect. For a long moment, the three of them stood there, man, daughter, and wolf, bound together by something greater than themselves. Then, as if satisfied, the wolf turned. It stepped forward, its powerful frame moving without hesitation. It did not run, nor did it linger. It simply disappeared into the trees, its silver coat swallowed by the swirling snow. The only thing left behind were its footprints, deep, defined, etched into the fresh white powder like a signature upon the earth. A mark. A sign. A testament to what had happened here, and to those who believed in miracles. Sarah wiped at her eyes, barely realizing the tears that had formed. She let out a breathless laugh, shaking her head. You know, if I write about this, no one's going to believe me. Walter chuckled, placing a hand on her shoulder. That's the thing about faith, Sarah. You don't always need proof. Sometimes, you just need to see the footprints. They stood there a moment longer, watching as the snow slowly began to erase the wolf's final trail. But even as the prints faded, they remained, not on the ground, but in their hearts. Because miracles were not always loud. Sometimes, they came in whispers. And sometimes, they came with amber eyes, hidden in the snow. As the snow continued to fall, erasing the last traces of footprints from the earth, one truth remained. Not everything abandoned is lost. The puppies were meant to perish, yet they were saved. The wolf was meant to hunt, yet it protected. Walter was meant to follow his usual path, yet he was led to where he was needed most. Some would call it luck. Some would call it coincidence. But those who have felt the quiet nudge of something greater, those who have seen light in the darkest of nights, those who have witnessed the impossible become reality, they know. This was no accident. It was grace. A reminder that God's miracles don't always come as fire from the sky or voices from the heavens. Sometimes, they come in the form of an old ranger with a good heart. Sometimes, they come in the form of a journalist seeking justice. And sometimes, they come as a lone wolf standing guard over the helpless. God moves in ways we do not always understand. But His presence is there, in the small moments, in the unseen hands that guide us, in the second chances we never expect. And tonight, He left His footprints in the snow. May God bless you and your loved ones, guiding you as He guided Walter. May you always find strength in times of darkness, warmth in times of cold, and courage in times of uncertainty. And may you never stop believing in the unseen miracles that walk beside us every day. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope today. Comment below, have you ever experienced a moment where you felt God's hand guiding you? Let's share our stories of faith, love, and second chances. And remember, you are never truly alone. Because sometimes, even in the deepest snow, God leaves footprints for us to follow. God bless you all.